Okay, welcome to the 86th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Dr. Mark Stibbe. Mark has been writing books since he was 16 and has clocked up over 50 titles. His PhD on storytelling was completed in 1982 and was published by Cambridge University Press. Lately, Mark has been writing novels in the magical realism genre. His novel, A Book in Time, was picked as the overall winner out of hundreds of entries in the Page-Turner Awards. His latest novel is The House of Dreams, a Tudor ghost story, once again in the magical realism genre. Mark's hobbies include Lego. He is the official Lego reviewer for Sorted Men's magazine. He also runs a new YouTube channel called The Christian Storyteller. He lives in Kent with his wife, Cherith, and their two Labradors, Bella and Phoebe. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Piers. I ought to point out that the two Labradors might make an audio appearance at some point if a postman comes to the door.
Okay, that would be good. We can name them as I've had the day with the BT engineer, been waiting for a few months to install fiber, so we shouldn't have
Great.
um, any noises in the background. The drilling's finished, so we're good.
Fantastic. Well, do send the engineer down to my house after she's finished, because we're still waiting for something as gloriously 21st century as fibre. We're
Yeah,
in a remote part of the world, and the internet can be very patchy.
right. Yeah, that was the reason we did it. I'm about a mile up a track with my wife, and so we thought, right, we'll get it sorted. So we
So
have.
pleased you've got it. Yeah, my poor wife, who's much younger than me, is permanently frustrated by the fact that she can't play Grand Theft Auto 5 on multiplayer and whatever it is, online, the online version. So she's stuck running around the city doing the same thing forever, which sounds to me like a vision of Dante's Inferno, but never mind.
Well, thank you for agreeing to come and speak today. And how I love to begin the podcast is for you just to share a little bit of your journey. What got you into writing? What got you into the work you now do?
Okay, so I think that the honest answer to that is that when I was a kid, I was aware that my dad was a great reader and that he'd written a book. This is my adoptive father, Philip Stibbe, and he loved reading to us. So when we were on holiday, I can remember particularly in a bungalow with no electricity and no TV and no distractions, he sat in an old, rather frail rocking chair and read the Chronicles of Narnia and Middle Earth to us. And when the chair stopped rocking, he obviously had gone to sleep, and we had to very quietly go to our bedrooms. And at that point, I was sharing a bedroom with my twin sister, Claire. We were very young, and we started, once Dad had finished telling his stories, we started telling each other ours. And that was really the genesis of both our writing careers. My twin sister, Claire, lives in Utah in the States, and she's a full-time crime fiction, psychological thriller novelist.
Wow.
So, yeah, I think you asked me the question, where does it all come from? I think it comes from probably that experience of when his stories ended, ours began. And the first thing I ever wrote was a 12-page handwritten piece called The Epic Adventures of Edward Bear. Edward was my teddy bear, and he got lost on a railway train. And my dad drove 12 and a half hours to find my teddy bear. It was located in a signalman's box, Inverness railway station. And so I imagined what it was like to be a teddy bear, abandoned and fending for himself. And actually, that turned out to be quite prescient, really, in some ways. So yes, I owe a lot to him. He was a star pupil of C.S. Lewis. He
Mm.
was at Merton College, Oxford, before and just after World War II, and his college professor of English was Tolkien. So
Wow.
I was an orphan in Hackney, and then I was plucked by these two wonderful people and adopted into a very book filled and story shaped world. It was magical.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Wow. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about what drew you to write your book, Home at Last, Freedom from Boarding School Pain.
Okay, that's a good question. I think the honest answer is probably something that looked to the outside world, for those who are interested in looking, like a breakdown. In 2012, I don't know that I really want to go into the details, but I had a massive implosion, and lost because of my own choices. I lost literally everything
Mhm.
and went from a life that looked very good on the outside, but which was fraught with pain on the inside. A good life that, I had a house and always wanted a house of my own, had a good job with a good salary. Um, I was doing well, if that's the right way of putting it, in the sort of conference speaking world, and traveling a lot and enjoying that quite a lot, the traveling aspect, seeing the world. But I lost everything, and I went to living out of the back of an old clapped out Saab estate, which broke down. I'd had an AA membership all my life and had never used it once. But in that year, I used it every month because this blinking Saab kept going wrong. I mean, no offense to Saab or Saab owners or Saab fans, but my particular Saab, which was given to me by a very compassionate friend, was so old that it just kept breaking down and became a bit of a metaphor for my life. So I signed up, thanks to two very dear old friends of mine who never stopped believing in me, even when I was in a total mess. They invested in me going to counselling for 2 years.
Mhm.
And I thought I had a pretty good idea what my problems were,
Mhm.
but I was being very typically arrogant and blind. And I remember Lynn, my counsellor, week 4, she reached behind her to a bookcase, opened it, and said, "Here, you need to read this. This is your real problem." And it was Nick Duffel's book, The Making of Them, about public school trauma. And I never knew that that book even existed, or that that topic was a subject of research and psychotherapeutic inquiry. So it took me by surprise. And she said, "Have you got somewhere safe to read it? Because it's going to really stir some visceral stuff." And I said, "Yeah, I've got my father's chair." My father had died by this point, and I was living in my mother's house. She'd gone into a nursing home, so our house was empty, but Dad's chair was in the conservatory. So I just sat in his chair, which was my safe place. And the moment I started reading, it was like not only the lights came on in terms of deep understanding in the head of um, in terms of diagnosis, but also just a completely broken heart.
Mhm.
Literally every page was like climbing a mountain. It was such an effort to read because the emotional heft in that book, the stories, particularly the testimonies of little boys who then become broken men. And there wasn't a single thing that I didn't relate to. And so for the next 2 years, instead of being a track that I thought we should go on, Lynn, with her incredible discernment and empathy, took us on a very different track. And that led to very deep healing over time. And that then led me to think I don't think I'm alone. And at that time, I was kind of my major audience was the church audience, not the mass market.
Mm.
So mainly religious readership and audiences. Um, and I had sort of kind of mentioned it a few times, just in passing, in conversations or in talks on completely different subjects. I would just bring in and say, because, when you're going through something like that, you can't help kind of, it comes out, it just seeps through your pores, it bleeds through you. And I remember one gentleman who was in his 80s coming up to me in tears afterwards. I mean, in absolute floods of tears, not just crying, but sobbing and saying that he had been beaten every day pretty well of his time at boarding school, and he had vowed he would never let his 4 sons go to boarding school, and he had kept his promise to himself and spared them that in spite of massive cultural familial pressures. And this was happening quite a lot. So I realized there's a lot of people out there just within my primary audience who have this deep-seated wound,
Mhm.
this trauma, whether the trauma was sudden, a sudden rupture, or it was developmental over time. This trauma is real for them. And they were taught big boys, big girls don't cry. And therefore, the whole of their lives, they've pushed it down. But it just took a couple of sentences from someone going through it, and the floodgates opened. And so I realized I have to write something on this. So I did.
Mm, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I can really resonate with your story. In 2002, it was 2000, I had a breakdown, and I didn't know it was anything to do with boarding school, but ended up being homeless for a period of time, drink, drugs, went to Africa to volunteer, and eventually I
Mm.
arrived in a Buddhist monastery, and I
Mm.
got
Mm.
told by a therapist very similar to you. She says, "Oh, you need to read this book called The Making of Them." And I
Mm.
went in one ear, went out the other. I didn't make a note of it, but got back to the
Mm.
monastery and that book was there. One of the monks
Amazing.
also been to boarding school, a boarding school in North Yorkshire, and
Yeah.
he'd been reading it and he finished it that day. And it was there, and like you, it just blew me away. Oh my God, that's me.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what I'm like.
Yes.
So many
Yeah.
moments. Wow. So, I mean, in the beginning of your book, you talk about the Christmas Carol. I found that very profound, the link. Could you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that? How
Yeah,
you came
sure.
across that link and
It was just, it was an epiphany. It was a sudden moment where I was so familiar with that story. Sorry, that's one of my Labradors barking. That's enough. Good girl. You be quiet. Um, that's Phoebe. She's a puppy. So in answer to your question, it was kind of epiphany. I had read it many times, A Christmas Carol, and I'd seen numerous filmic versions. And it was actually watching a Muppet Christmas Carol, which of course we will, I'm sure, agree is the best,
of
along
course.
with Alistair Sim's incredible version from the late 50s. But it was Michael Caine being taken by the ghost of Christmas past, who in the Muppet version, that ghost is strangely childlike. And it's so powerful that because it's really an angelic, healed, innocent child ghost taking Scrooge, the grown-up misery, back to his childhood to show him really where things started to go wrong. And the first place he goes to is his prep school. And this I'd not noticed before I started the process of being counselled for my own boarding school pain. But I really began to notice it then that Dickens had had this extraordinary psychological insight that this moment in Scrooge's backstory of being a child, a young boy in a boarding school, far too young in a boarding school, left behind, abandoned at Christmas. And it says that he was solitary and deserted and neglected. And that when the grown Scrooge saw this, he sobbed. So the first thing that really struck me, Piers, was the fact that Dickens, well before the age of psychology, well before Freud, anyone, had understood that grown-up people, grown-up adults like Scrooge, are the products of childhood pain. But the genius of it was that he'd seen that it was shame, the feeling of being unworthy of love and of belonging, and that shame derived from boarding school desertion and boarding school abandonment. And then the second thing that really struck me with force was that Dickens understood that you do need, and this is where I think, I know there's a debate to be had, but Dickens understood that you need heaven's help as well as earth's help to get some measure of lasting breakthrough and transformation. And he therefore saw that these three ghosts, and the number three has always struck me as being significant because it parallels the Trinity, a bit like the three figures in the Polar Express, which are clearly meant to represent the Trinity, but this is kind of early version of that, a Dickensian foretaste. Dickens is saying to us, don't neglect the spiritual dimension to your healing. So the kind of discussions I have with, and have had historically, far too few, unfortunately, with Nick Duff or Joy Chavarine, people like that, who I immensely like and respect, has really been over the whole psycho-spiritual integration in therapeutic approaches to boarding school pain, that it's not just cognitive psychotherapeutic techniques, but there has to be some attendance to the soul as well. And that is something that Dickens saw. And I just don't know how, I have no idea how Dickens could have that level of insight into the orphan heart. Because Scrooge really is a boarding school orphan there. His parents won't come, his father won't come and fetch him home. He's fatherless. He might just as well be an actual orphan, but in his heart, he is an orphan. But Dickens understood orphans better than any other writer, in my humble opinion, who's ever lived. And that has to itself, in my opinion, been something heavenly by way of, it's a transcendent level of revelation and disclosure to me, because it's so brilliant. As an orphan myself, as someone who's left an orphanage in Hackney in 1960, I can only marvel at the way in which Dickens kind of navigates his way through the heart of the orphan and understands also what's needed for the healing of the orphan.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really powerful because I hadn't realized the connection between Scrooge and boarding school. It's only when I was listening to your audiobook, it's like, I had not picked that up. And it makes so
Nor
much
do I.
sense.
Yeah, nor do I, for years, years and years and years. And it took Lynn sitting me down and saying, read the making of them, and then my eyes being opened. And then I started to see things, connections everywhere, actually, not just in Dickens.
I I guess I'm fascinated. So I've read many books of people's biographies, autobiographies. I don't know if you realize that in Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, he says that in a conversation he had with John Bowlby, that 1984, according to him, was based on his boarding school experience. And so many of these stories that, James
Yeah.
Bond's written by an Etonian. You see
Yes.
so many of these stories. I was watching
Yes.
the Dark Materials trilogy, And the front cover of Nick Duffel's book, Wounded Leaders, is a quote from Philip Pullman saying the horrible boarding school thing. And I'm like, oh, so many levels to British literature and that link with boarding school. Roald Dahl.
Yes, it's everywhere.
Mm,
It's everywhere.
mm. So I'd love for you to share, if you feel comfortable, a little bit about your boarding school experience. How was that for you?
Well, I think I describe it as a second orphaning. That's the only way I can really encapsulate it in a short kind of title or phrase. When I was orphaned in 1960, along with my twin sister, that was our first orphaning. And we weren't really at all conscious of what was going on. We were babies. We were in a home for unmarried mums and their babies in North London, looked after by Anglican nuns. I mean, our story is a bit like an episode of Call the Midwife, which is why I can't watch Call the Midwife. I would love to, because everyone says it's amazing, but I've watched a couple of episodes and it's just too much. But I wasn't really aware, and Claire wasn't really aware of what was going on. And we entered what I call the golden age of my childhood then, because we're adopted by Philip and Joy. Philip read stories to us, blah, blah, blah. And we grew up to the age of 7. I mean, I probably should just tell my own story, not Claire's. I grew up to the age of 7. And then I became aware of talk of being sent away to boarding school. And it had a seismic effect, Piers, on my soul. I knew that something really terrible was about to happen to me. And there was a lot of kind of justification going on that this is going to be the making of you, which was I was so struck by Nick's title, because that's exactly the message that was sold to me. The world's going to be your oyster. This is the best education that money can buy. It's a fully rounded education, which is also a lie, by the way, but we can come to that. You'll be a fully rounded individual. You'll be a success, all of this. So going through my sevens, as it were, I was aware that this was the end of a golden age. And then when I was sent away to boarding school, it was to a prep school on my 8th birthday. I remember, and so many people that I've talked to and who have read Home at Last, my book, have said the same story. It's all about the gravel. It's all about the tires. It's about pulling up in front of a big house and hearing the tires of your parents' car crunching the stones as the car leaves and leaves you behind sitting on a Mossman trunk. And in my case, with a head teacher, I just knew with a child's instinct was not safe, was dangerous. And I was right, because on my first night, I dropped a bag of marbles that my dad had given me to try and keep me cheerful. And it fell all the way down this heavy oak staircase and hit a door at the bottom that just happened to be this headmaster's study. And he ran up with a cane and beat me 6 of the best in front of the entire dormitory on my birthday, on my first night. And I hid underneath the bedclothes when the lights went out. And I just made a decision there and then. I'm not going to feel again, because there's no way I can survive the next. I knew it was 10 years. This was a 10-year sentence, because I knew that this is the way the narrative goes. I'll be 5 years in this place with that man with his cane. And I was beaten a further 3 times in my first fortnight by him for no reason whatsoever, other than that he loved beating. And I've got another 5 years after that in a public school somewhere. And so I just resolved, I made this inner vow, I'm not going to feel. And I've given that a name. I call it the boarded heart. And I live with that. And that's how I got through Piers. Now, what's interesting to me is other friends of mine, most people say that that's their story. Most people say that's their story, that they disconnected and disengaged emotionally because they didn't want to be accused of being wet,
Mm.
um, on all that horrible stuff, that peer group stuff. But I've had one person at least, Charlie Mackesy, who wrote this amazing book about the mole, the fox, the boy, and the horse, with his just matchless paintings, and whose book was probably the best-selling non-fiction book in lockdown, in the pandemic, and was turned into a Christmas Day animated film. Charlie has said that his boarding school experience had the opposite effect. He was already empathic, a feeler, which most artists are, and that's why they're artists. But then what happened was, instead of him switching off his emotions, his feelings then went into overdrive. So instead of decreasing the volume emotionally in his life, it turned it whole levels up. And so, you can't generalize too much about the effects of boarding school trauma. But for me, you asked me my story. I was so traumatized by that. And I call it my second orphaning because I feel like I was orphaned again because I just didn't have any attachment from that moment on to the parents who'd adopted me and had looked after me well. Um, and it was worse somehow this time round, and I'll finish with this, because I was conscious of the damn thing happening, whereas the first time round, I wasn't really aware, and nor was Claire, but this time it was like every single event and moment, it was graphic, vivid, and I was living it, conscious of it. It was in the foreground. It wasn't something rumbling away in the distant background.
Mm, thank you. Thank you. It's really, I can really feel that. I thank you for sharing your story, and I can resonate with doing a similar thing. I think I was age 11 and I loved the first 3 weeks. I was away from family. It was like I hadn't understood what it meant. It was fun. It was a
Yeah.
bit like a holiday camp. I was confident, popular. And then after 3 weeks, my mother didn't come for a leave day. And suddenly I was like, oh, I wanted to go home then. And I cried in the dormitory, and 30 boys came and jumped into the cubicle and started laughing at me. There was no doors. And it was at that point I was like, same thing. I'm not going to feel again. I'm not going to give you that power over me ever again. And I don't think
Mm.
I cried really again until I was in my mid-20s when I started to have my breakdown. So I can really resonate. Um, yeah, and I could resonate again that thing about not everyone is negatively impacted by boarding school. I mean, in my experience working one to one and over the years, my my sense is it's about 5 to 10% thrive from boarding school. That's my sense, which most people, I've been reading lots of biographies. Tony Blair,
Mm.
on the surface, I thought, oh, he's obviously had a great time. It's like he was beaten really
Mm.
badly. He ran away. He tried to leave the country. So it's
Mm.
interesting as I read biographies about it. So,
Yeah. And you wonder also, you wonder of those 5 or 10% that said they had a jolly good time, thank you, and what's all the fuss about? I've met a few like that, and I've wondered if there's a little bit of denial going on and an unwillingness, and quite understandably so. There's no judgment from me on this one,
mm,
but you look at them, and I'm thinking of one guy right now, and I think, but you live like a man in pain, and
mm,
if it doesn't come from there, being sent away, exiled, and homesick, where does it come from?
mm,
Um, And I'm not, again, I never would judge anyone, because I think one of the things I learned it's a really powerful lesson when the story of my abuse by John Smythe QC came out in 2017 on Channel 4 News. A number of us who had been at the same boarding school, who had been abused by John Smythe, kind of basically formed a group of friendship and love with each other that I think will last the rest of our lives. And we reacted very differently to the trauma. And we agreed that everybody's reaction was valid. And nobody was to say that this is the reaction you're supposed to have. And that every one of us was to accept one another's journey as right for them. And so I take that view. It was a very important lesson in giving victims of boarding school trauma the right to have positive, unconditional regard, whatever.
Yeah, yeah, I so agree. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I did interview um, a priest, not necessarily about the John Smythe case, but about a year and a half ago, just talking about speaking up about what was happening in the
Yeah.
church, and
Yeah. It's
bringing more
very difficult.
transparency. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the problems is that the Church of England, which was my denomination for a long time, I served as a vicar for 25 years. It's especially adept at kind of maneuvering itself into denial and deflection and distancing, because a lot of the people who run it are ex-boarders who have learnt how to do that. And that's another subject which Nick Duffel, I think, has written very powerfully about, the whole thing about wounded leaders. That
Mm.
many of our institutions in this country are led by people, ex-boarders, who have never really properly dealt with their own pain, and therefore, because they switched off emotionally, they lack empathy. And a leader without empathy is lethal.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, it's interesting. Someone reached out to me and pointed out that I think the head of the church, not Justin Welby, who was at Eton, but the head of the administration, was at my school. He was a couple of years older than me, but it's now come out in the press that it was the worst sexual abuse probably in this country during that period of time. Literally hundreds of people were abused, and this is now the guy who's in charge. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh wow, oh wow. Um,
Yeah.
so I mean, I was listening to your talk, which is online, talking about leadership, and tell me if this doesn't work, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, you know, leadership. You talked in that about this idea of the pharaohs and Moses, and I could really relate to that, looking at our current leadership in this country and seeing
Mm.
that my projection is so many of our leaders are pharaohs. It's about
Yeah.
them and power. Could you, would you be up for talking a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, I can mention that for a moment. Basically, I've been talking about this for quite a while, actually. I call it the leadership mosaic. Mosaic from the idea that you can have patterns that are not complete, but which are meaningful. And mosaic, as in the adjective from Moses' name. And so, what I've been working on is a mosaic of leadership qualities. And right at the heart of this is the difference between Pharaoh and Moses, between what I call slavery and sonship or daughterhood. Because obviously men and women can lead. I'm not one of those people that colludes with the conservative Christian heresy that women are to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. No, they can be everything that a man can be, and sometimes a lot more. So it is the difference between slavery and sonship slash daughterhood. So Pharaoh is a leader who whips other people who are his servants into building a monument in his memory, whereas Moses is an orphan. He is quite literally orphaned. So he grows up with a confused orphan heart. He doesn't really understand who he is. He walks like an Egyptian. He talks like an Egyptian. Feel a song coming on here. But he isn't an Egyptian. He was adopted by an Egyptian princess. Um, but he relates to and instinctively empathizes with the Hebrew slaves. And so when he sees one being badly mistreated, he acts out of anger and kills the soldier and is then sent into the desert. And the desert is a school really for Moses, where he is confronted by an extraordinarily numinous phenomenon, which is the burning bush, the bush that is burning but not being consumed. And God, Yahweh, the Lord of the universe, addresses him and says, "Take off your shoes, Moses, for you are standing on holy ground." And in the Middle Eastern context, when you visit a house where somebody really wants to make you feel welcome, you're asked to take off your shoes. It's another way of saying, it's like a social code saying, make yourself at home in our presence. And so to have God saying to an orphan, make yourself at home in my presence, is life-changing. It's revolutionary. It doesn't change him in the entirety of his being straight away, because there's a rewiring of the brain that needs to follow every revelation in the heart. So he still messes up. Moses, even after having this extraordinary explosion of love in his life, he says, effectively, I don't want to do this job that you've asked me to do. Here am I, send somebody else. So that's the orphan again. So you see how this man whom God is trying to develop into a son, if it was a woman, it would be a daughter, as opposed to a slave, is taking time to develop. That's me, that's you, Piers. We don't get healed in an instant. Our therapy is a journey over a long period of time. It never may be finished this side of eternity. And so, I think that Moses is such a great and graphic picture of what, and certainly the heavenly blueprint is for leadership. Leadership, yeah, you can say it's about skills and capabilities and eloquence and this and that. But at the end of the day, the best leaders are people who are emotionally healthy and have become so over time by opening themselves up with transparency and vulnerability to whatever healing presence is offered to them that works for them on their journey. And in Moses' case, it was, Yahweh saying, make yourself at home in my presence, which is so tender. The Charlton Heston view of this particular episode is really quite epic and military and sensationalist. But actually, I think it was a really tender moment where a man who'd never known his dad and who'd lost all contact with his mother, biologically speaking, is approached by this substitute father who's perfect and loving and invited to come home. And that's what, at the end of the day, all orphans want. And we're all of us flipping orphans.
Yeah. Yeah.
Looking for home.
Thank you. An orphan looking for home. Yeah. Interesting, as part of the retreat, making a documentary at the moment about the impact of boarding school on our leaders. And we're filming a retreat in a couple of weeks, and the name of the retreat is Coming Home.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. It kind of reminds me, as I was listening to you speak earlier on the this interview, I'll put it into the show notes so people can look at it. You talk about fathering, the importance of fathering and mothering as leader. And
Mm.
and I was, yeah, really struck by that, just the importance of that and how I didn't get fathered or mothered at school.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah, nor did I. And actually, nor could we have expected to, because matron cannot be our mother and the housemaster cannot be our father. And, when those sorts of needs are exploited by older men and women, therein lies a lot of a hornet's nest of evil. But nevertheless, I do think there is something in the way I was treated at boarding school by one teacher that was, in a wholesome way, a
mm,
kind of fatherly model of leadership.
mm,
And I can also think of women in my life who have led in a way that was healthily maternal to me. And when you think of the enormous love deficit in those of us who've been sent away to boarding school in the area of father and mother, it just makes sense in this very orphan generation for leaders in a healthy, and I stress a healthy way, because abusers get hold of this and then completely turn it into something chthonic, demonic, dark, horribly evil and oppressive to young people. But if healed up, this is, I think, Nick Duffel's wounded leader stuff again. If as leaders we can have our own emotional health tuned up,
mm,
um, and I think radically improved, and then we can perhaps adopt more of a parenting style of leadership that's empowering, that's encouraging, that's wanting to cheer the people on that you're leading to go further ever than you have been, because you're not threatened by their success. You're championing it because you're healed. You're not insecure. You're not threatened and fearful like an orphan. You're behaving like a son or a daughter, which is behaving like the best version of yourself. So I think there is, I mean, you can tell I haven't fully fleshed this out. You can tell that this is almost thinking out loud.
mm,
And for an introvert, external processing is a terrible thing. But I'm risking it because I think there's something in it.
mm. Thank you. I can really resonate with that. And I see that. I can see within myself as, wanting to support others. And there is that part of me that I learned at school was I've got to disappear within. I've got to take care of myself, which is what I see with our leaders doing in the country at the moment. They,
Yeah.
I've read David Cameron's book, Tony Blair. They're saying, I'm getting into this because I want to help others. But as soon as they go into that trauma state of the stress, power, they go into the default of it's all about me. It's about me amassing. So, they're not doing it on purpose per se. Um, and this importance of fathering, bringing people up, being better than we are. It's
Mm.
there's a beautiful book, forgotten the name of the man who wrote it, but Servant Leadership. This idea that
Yes.
here to serve.
Greenleaf.
Greenleaf,
Yeah.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
a brilliant book. And that's 100% the difference between Pharaoh and Moses. Pharaoh's leadership was a leadership to be served, whereas Moses's leadership was much more getting in the desert with the people, opening up the tent, adjudicating problems, being there for people. I mean, that was a danger for him as well. He had to be told by the best father-in-law in history, Jethro, the first organizational consultant in the whole of human history, had to be told to delegate. But the thing was, at least he was involved. He was there because he wanted desperately to serve these people who had been so traumatized by the experience of slavery. And I think there is something very wholesome in that model. And servant leadership is what it's all about. And that's very interesting because as a Christian, I look at Jesus and he said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. For me, that's like the prototype of servant leadership. So the business gurus talk all the time about servant leadership, but I think it's footnotes to Jesus of Nazareth, who washed his own disciples' smelly feet. And so I think there's a lot already in our history that's so like signposts or Belisha beacons or stars saying, look here, that it's already there, and stop trying to busk it the whole time because it's not working.
Yeah, yeah, so true. I love that analogy of, yeah, Jesus washing his disciples' feet. In the tradition I lived in, the Thai forest tradition, the teacher would, I guess it's slightly different, but the students would wash the teacher's feet. And at the
Mm.
beginning, this Western monk, Ajahn Sumedho, was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not washing his feet. That's stupid. Within a few weeks, he was like, oh, he wanted to be one of them because he was like to be close.
That's brilliant.
So,
I love it.
so
Mm. I love it.
I'd love you to talk a little bit about, you talk a bit in the book about soul abandonment, and we talked a little
Mm.
bit about the spiritual side, but I'd love you to speak a little bit about that, about how that felt for you and you see in others potentially
Yeah.
this abandonment and soul abandonment.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is just my way of thinking. Okay, so everyone has their own way of thinking, but for me, the soul doesn't need to necessarily be connected to the spiritual world because the soul in my life, my spirit is what is connected to the spiritual world, but my soul, that is the epicenter for me of my thinking, feeling, and choosing. So those are the three, for me, the three dimensions of soul life. They are the rational, they are the emotional, and they are the volitional. And my body connects me to the world, to the natural environment, to my two black Labradors, etc. My soul connects me to you, connects me to my wife, who is my soulmate, because I find in her somebody with whom her thinking, feeling, and choosing, and my thinking, feeling, and choosing mesh so well. It feels like we are soulmates. But then the spirit of me is that part that is, I think, designed to connect with the divine in whatever form that takes for you. So we're talking about what in the ancient Greek language would be soma, from which we get somatic or psychosomatic. That's the body. We're talking about psyche, Psyche, from which we get psychology, which is the soul.
Mhm.
And then we're talking about pneuma, from which we get pneumatic, as in drills, which means spirit, which is much more to do with the spiritual quest of human beings. So, in my soul, which is the thinking, feeling, choosing center of my personality as a human being, the effect, sorry, that was a long preamble. The effect of being sent away to boarding school was massive. It was like tectonic plates shifting and a tsunami result from it. And the thing that I felt, I would describe it now as ruptured attachment from the golden age of my childhood, where I'd learned to trust again and to attach and be attached. And it was healthy attachment. It was not ambivalent attachment. It wasn't abusive attachment. It was really secure attachment. From that, in a single day, and particularly my first night, where I experienced abuse on top of abandonment, I would call that ruptured attachment now. Then I would have called it abandonment. And abandonment is something that we need to understand in two senses, both objective and subjective. So abandonment is, first of all, an event. It's something that happens to you, outside of you. So I had no control, you probably didn't, as a child, over the whole process of decision making and then actually being sent away. The powerlessness of a child in this situation, well, it's always been done that way. My father, his father, his father, generational and cultural slavery, really, it is in many ways, I think. And so you're powerless. You are in that slave system. You get sent away. That's something that happens to you, but then there's something that happens in you. So abandonment is an external event, but it's also an internal reaction. I feel left behind. I feel like I'm left alone. I feel deeply as if I've been deserted, and there's something wrong with me to have deserved being put in this place, beaten by this man, and forced to make a vow of emotional detachment. And so abandonment is something that happens within the soul, I think, of a human being. So you carry that, and I carry that in our story. And, it'll always be there. It'll always be there. But the thing is, I think at the time, what happens is the soul goes into a kind of split state. And the child says, at the level of feelings, I feel absolutely traumatized and devastated. But then at the level of thoughts and thinking, the experience begins to be rationalized. Oh, my parents have told me that this is something that they've paid a great price for me to experience because it's going to reap incredible rewards in the longer term of my life. And so whilst feelings say, I'm really in pain in the most unprecedented way, and I don't know what to do with this pain, thoughts say, yeah, but you got to put up with it. Be a man. Big boys don't cry. It's going to be something that's going to make you an incredible force to be reckoned with in the world. And so feelings then get subjugated, I think, beneath thoughts in this split soul syndrome, as I call it, where the event of abandonment, which produces feelings of being abandoned, are gradually, I think, they are gradually obliterated in place of a way of thinking that rationalizes the whole experience with the parental lie. And the parental lie is one that, they mean well. Parents, they're not normally cruel. They're not putting you in these schools or us in these schools because they want to torment us. They've believed a lie themselves that's been passed on either through their culture or through the generations of their family. And therefore, you can't feel like you want to protest and become a rebel. You feel like you have to conform to the experience and be grateful because of the price that's been paid. So I think the cost to the human soul when it comes to abandonment is very big indeed and takes a while to heal.
Wow, that's really profound. I found that very clear. And there's many different strands I could go down on there, but I was reading a book called Almost Boys. It's just been sent it by an educational psychologist who's written about her experiences at boarding school. And she talks about that parental lie. And fascinating, yeah, I can really resonate with that. And the split soul syndrome. Yeah, I see that it's such a complex thing. I mean, I felt at boarding school we were told stories of the people who tried to run away and they were brought back by their parents. And it was like all of these options of trying to get away from the school. It's like, well, no, you can't escape. And, you know, it, felt like a prison. It was,
And it's interesting if I can just pop this thought in here, if that's okay. The power of music. I just want to mention that for just one moment because it just leapt into my head. I remember sitting with a bishop, an African bishop, who told me that when he was 5, his parents said to him, we're just leaving you with your uncle and auntie, and we'll be back soon. And they never came back. And at the time, there was a record playing a Beatles song in Uncle and Auntie's house.
Mm.
And he'd forgotten about that. And he walked into a shopping mall in America, and the music playing in the mall was the same Beatles song. And he'd pushed down this experience of abandonment all his life. And he just sat in the middle of this shopping mall with his purple shirt and his white dog collar, crying his eyes out because the music had connected him with the pain. And I think there is something about music in terms of healing. Yeah, there is something about this because it does touch us at a soul level, doesn't it? At a very deep level. And I'm thinking right now, David Cameron, you've insisted on mentioning people like that, for which, I don't blame you at all because they're prime examples. But just do you remember what happened to Cameron when he resigned? He was standing outside number 10 Downing Street and he let go. He just said goodbye. And then he turned around to walk back towards number 10 and he started humming this tune. And all the composers, the boffin composers of Great Britain got hold of this melody and tried to identify what it was. And they couldn't, but somebody has turned it into a piano concerto on YouTube. You can find it. It's exhilarating. It's absolutely brilliant. And I think what happened to Cameron was that when he walked away from that microphone, he walked away from his public persona, his mask that had been part of his armor since boarding school days. And suddenly this song began to come out of him, this music began to pour out of his soul. And that's part of his healing. And if he could only just hold on to that rather than reverting back into the mask life, into the public persona mode of living, without that emotional health. The emotional health for David Cameron lies in that tune.
I'll look that up. I'll put it into the description if I can find it. David Cameron humming concerto. Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I think music, I found that as a powerful way for healing myself is some of the tunes. So my boarding school experience was rather unpleasant. A friend committed suicide and when I was 14 and it was 1990, so there was a lot of Manchester music, Happy Mondays, Stone Roses, bands like that. So I
Mm.
found listening to some of those tunes again that we played around that time, a lot of tears came up because there was so much
Yeah.
emotion stored in that music, but I couldn't access. And Robert Moore, in his book, The Lover Within, and the Jungian analyst talking about the archetypes, he says often it's very healing if we can paint or draw using colors because that accesses the pre kind of
Mm.
verbal part of our brains. And I found
I
that
love that.
while I was in the monastery, I started to paint with color. It was my Jungian analyst who recommended I did that. And there were
I
so
love that.
many tears that came up. And like that, I found that with music,
Mm.
connecting in with that emotional body. Um,
Mm.
well, I probably could talk for a long time, Mark. I'm really enjoying this. Um, I'd love for us maybe as we start wrapping this up, just the healing part. So your book, there's a big aspect of the healing. What would you like to share around that? You know, what would you suggest to people who've been to boarding school or listening to this? What's been your experience of that transformation?
I think for me, the answer to that lies in the figure of the father. And I'm not in any way decrying or playing down the figure of the mother. I might come to that as well. But the figure of the father is extremely important to me and has been ever since I was a curate in the Church of England, when I didn't realize how wounded I had been not knowing my biological father and him not knowing of my existence. So it was always a big issue for me. And then I remember one evening I took a group of teenagers because, of course, one of the things that happens when you get ordained, if you ever get ordained, is that if you're younger than the vicar, which is always the case pretty well if you're the curate, you get sent off to do the youth work. Well, I had no training for that whatsoever. So I came under extreme stress from these stroppy teens. And I took them off to a youth sort of event. And a song was playing. Again, it's music. Isn't it funny? We're coming to music. It was a song about being adopted, that the Father in heaven, whom I was called to represent as a clergy person, that the Father in heaven is an adopting dad who will never abandon me. And I was listening to this, and it was a bit like the bishop, the African bishop. I just started crying. And the stroppy teenagers looked at me and said, "What's happened to the curate?" And it was an absolutely life-changing moment, because I saw then that, for me, I've been brought up with this religious God, which is the God of the slaves, the master who whips you. And that was very much the theme of my abuser, who was an evangelical who literally beat the hell out of us in a criminal way whenever we sinned, as he saw it. And so I had been brought up with that kind of toxic fundamentalist religion, which did me no end of damage. But with that one song, all of that changed. I thought, I'm going to make the decision right here and now that I'm teaching these teenagers about a loving father who wants to adopt and never abandon them. Well, we had kids in our youth group who had no parents, who were living in great poverty, and who just known trauma in terms of attachment. But when they heard that message, they were completely overwhelmed by love. And so we created, as a youth group, a kind of family, a recovering family around that revelation. So when I came to, say, that was dealing with my first orphaning, if you will, being abandoned as a child. But what I'd never done is connected all of that to my second orphaning as a boarding school survivor. And so when Lynn led me through this journey of 2 years of therapy, of counseling rather, I came back to that figure, and I came back to what I think is the most beautiful story ever told, which was when Jesus of Nazareth talked about a son who'd got lost in the far country and who had rebelled against this amazing father's love, got covered in pig poo, and then decided life couldn't be any worse. I'm going to go back to my dad. And he comes home smelling of the pig pen. In fact, the father probably smelt him before he saw him. And the father runs out. Now, keep in mind, this is a Jewish boy covered in pig poo. You don't get much lower than that, because pigs are non-kosher animals. This is the whole point of the story. But the father lifts up his robe. No man over 30 ever lifted up his robe in public in that culture, because it was a source of enormous shame. But this father doesn't care. He wants to get to his son and embrace him. There's no talk of "I forgive you," because the forgiveness and the longing of the father's heart is expressed in the fact that he embraces him, he kisses him over and over and over again, and tells the people standing around to go and fetch the robe of great honor for VIPs who visited his village, and put it on his son's shoulders, and to put this ring on his son's finger, the ring of position. You are a son in my family. You don't have to be a slave groveling in front of me. I accept you. I no strings attached. My mercy and my love for you is unconditional. And I look at that story and I think, I don't know a single person who is still suffering from a homesick soul from boarding school days who wouldn't be touched by that story. And the thing for me is, this is where Nick Duffel and I will agree. For him, the father is a fictional figure, Whereas for me, the father is the most real person in my life, even more real than my Labradors, my wife, my 4 children, my 2 grandchildren. This father is the one thing, his love for me is the one thing that will last into eternity. So it's the only thing I can take with me is this bond, this connection to the love of all loves, this father who loves me like no earthly father ever could. So for me, I think that healing is spiritual as well as psychological and physical. There's something about this that I think is really important. And I think when boarders get a whiff of this grace, this unconditional love, this amazing mercy, and the fact that this love is never going to abandon them, it's never going to be ruptured because nothing can separate us from this love. That's really profound news, and it's good for the soul.
Mm. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think I could probably carry on for another little bit and take us down another few uh, alleyways, and I'm aware we've come to an hour. So, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with my audience and with the?
I mean, I think one of the subjects, Piers, that I feel like we haven't covered enough in boarding school therapy is the subject of forgiveness. And I feel like one of the things that's been a massive component in my therapeutic journey has been coming to a place where forgiveness can be offered as a free and undeserved gift. And that forgiveness is towards my parents, towards some of the teachers, some of the school kids that wounded me. And it's to myself I've got to offer that free gift as well. And perhaps most importantly of all, because I found in my 2 years of counselling, the thing that took longest for me was not forgiving dad and mum and all the others. It was forgiving myself. And that, was a long, hard trek. And so I would just put that out there that I think that we need to talk about this a bit more, because I think forgiveness, we look at it and we think that whilst we remain in unforgiveness and bitterness towards those who put us in that place and exploited us in that place, that somehow that we are putting them in prison and keeping them captive by our distance, by our unpleasantness, or whatever it might be. But actually, we're keeping ourselves in prison. And I think that forgiveness is a golden key, that when we offer it to others and when we offer it to ourselves, unlocks the manacles around our hands and feet and the cell door in the small space in which we've been living, the restricted space in which we've been living, and allows us out into the vast landscape of sunlight and freedom that I believe is the basic human right of every boarding school girl and boy.
Beautiful. Yeah, so agree. So agree. Forgiveness, the importance of forgiveness. And yeah, I think that's one of the things I found hardest was forgiving myself for many years. So bless you. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Mark. And I put in the description place to buy Mark's books and also Mark's website as well. So thank you.
Very kind. People may be interested to know, Piers, that my latest novel, House of Dreams, is about a boarding school survivor called Tony,
Oh.
who finds his, I won't say too much, but he's a boarding school survivor, a dream therapist of international reputation, who, because of his divorce and various other things happening in his life, has lost the capacity to dream and needs more therapy than he can give, and finds a magical old house with a 500-year-old secret. And the soul of Tony's house and the house of Tony's soul start speaking to one another through dreams. And then there's an epiphany at the end to do with boarding school. And that's all I'll say.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. Beautiful. I look forward to reading it. Right. Well, take care. A real pleasure speaking with
And
you.
you,
Okay.
bless you as well, Piers. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you.